Okay, so you want to own a toll bridge. You picture a chain or a gate or a booth. Cars roll up. A driver hands over a few dollars, or a sensor reads a transponder, and the gate lifts. Multiply that by 10,000 cars a day, add a few hundred trucks, and the picture writes itself. No inventory. No employees chasing customers. No competitor down the block. Because there is no down the block. There's only the river, and your bridge is the only way across it. That's the fantasy. You buy the bridge. Cars arrive. They have no other route. They pay. You collect. You sit back. The problem is what happens between the dream and the river. A toll bridge isn't really a piece of concrete and steel. It's a legal monopoly over a physical bottleneck. And monopolies are only worth something for as long as they stay monopolies. The entire economics of owning a bridge come down to one uncomfortable question. What happens the day someone builds a second one? Start with what you're actually buying, because it isn't a bridge in the way people think. A toll bridge behaves like a locked gate on the only road out of town. You're not buying steel and cable. You're buying the legal right to stand between someone and where they need to go, and charge them for the privilege. That right is the entire asset. Take away the exclusivity, and you're left with an aging structure that costs a fortune to maintain and collects almost nothing. Getting into this business is not cheap, and it is rarely fast. In Richmond, Virginia, a private consortium spent roughly $324 million building a toll road across the James River, including a large, high-clearance span now known as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Bridge, tall enough to let ocean-going ships pass beneath it on their way to the port of Richmond. Only about $9 million of that came from federal money. The rest came from private financing, betting on future toll revenue that didn't exist yet. That's the part people miss. The interest on that debt starts accruing long before a single car crosses the span. Construction takes years. Approvals take longer. Every month before opening day is a month of costs with zero revenue to offset them. Before a single toll is ever collected, there's another layer of spending most people never think about. Environmental review. Right-of-way acquisition, which means buying out or condemning private land along the approach roads. Engineering studies to satisfy navigation requirements. Because a bridge crossing a shipping channel has to clear vessels that haven't been built yet. Bond insurance. Legal fees to defend the franchise itself, because someone, somewhere, will challenge your right to build. None of that shows up in the glossy rendering of the finished bridge. All of it shows up on the balance sheet before a single car has ever paid a toll. The road opened in 2002, and this is where the fantasy started to collapse. Traffic showed up at roughly 42% of what the projections promised. Not a shortfall, a collapse. The nearby suburbs that were supposed to fill with commuters never grew the way planners assumed. The tolls coming in weren't even enough to cover the state's maintenance costs, let alone repay the debt used to build it. By 2004, barely 2 years after opening, the operator was staring at bankruptcy. Here's what nobody tells you before they buy into a toll asset. The bridge doesn't fail because too few people want to drive. It fails because someone in a spreadsheet years earlier guessed wrong about how many people would want to drive, and the entire financial structure was built on top of that guess, like a house built on a number, instead of a foundation. An Australian infrastructure firm, Transurban, stepped in and paid the Virginia Department of Transportation roughly $611 million for a 99-year concession, betting it could do better. It added a connector to Richmond's airport. It waited. Traffic slowly grew. By 2006, tolls finally covered the road's day-to-day operating costs. But covering operating costs and repaying the capital that built the thing are two entirely different problems. That's the first revenue engine, and it's the one everybody understands. A car crosses. It pays a toll. Multiply by volume. It looks enormous when you say it fast. Tens of thousands of crossings a day, each one worth a few dollars, adds up to real money. But gross toll revenue is misleading because a huge share of it has to go toward interest payments on the debt that built the bridge in the first place. Debt that doesn't care whether traffic hits projections or not. There's usually a second revenue engine sitting quietly beside the toll booth, and it can matter more than people assume. A bridge that controls the only crossing point also controls everything clustered around that crossing point. Duty-free retail at the plaza, fuel sales to trucks that have to slow down anyway, warehousing and staging lots for freight waiting to cross. None of that shows up as toll revenue in a headline, but it rides on the exact same monopoly. A car has to pass through your gate. Once it's there, waiting, slowing down, or idling in a queue, it becomes a captive customer for whatever else you happen to be selling. Then something changed. The 2008 recession arrived, and the wave of new suburban development the whole project depended on simply stopped. Home construction financing dried up. The commuters who were supposed to fill those subdivisions and drive across that bridge every morning never arrived. Because the subdivisions themselves were never finished. By 2012, Transurban wrote off its entire $130 million investment. By 2013, it told a consortium of European banks holding roughly $300 million in project loans that it would not be repaying them. Operational control passed to the lenders. A services company took over daily operations in 2014. A Spanish infrastructure firm eventually bought the whole thing in 2016. 3 different owners in 14 years on a single bridge because the original math was wrong by more than half. That's the trap hiding inside every toll asset. The fixed costs, construction debt, interest, maintenance, staffing, technology, don't move. They sit there every single day, whether 10,000 cars cross or 4,000 do. The revenue is entirely dependent on how many people show up and choose to pay. When the forecast is wrong, there's no way to shrink the debt to match. The revenue disappears. The costs do not. And Pocahontas Parkway wasn't alone. Around the same time, the state of Indiana leased its 157-mile toll road to a private consortium for $3.8 billion, financed with roughly $3 billion in debt. When the 2014 bankruptcy filing came, analysts pointed to a different mechanism than Richmond's. Not a demand collapse this time, but leverage. The consortium had borrowed so aggressively to win the lease in the first place that even ordinary expected traffic couldn't generate enough cash to service the debt. 2 different toll roads. 2 different structural weaknesses. Same underlying lesson. The bridge or road itself was never really the asset. The financing sitting on top of it was. So who actually wins at this business? Look upriver from Richmond to Detroit, and the picture flips entirely. The Ambassador Bridge connects Detroit to Windsor, Ontario, and it is one of the only privately owned international border crossings on the continent. It opened in 1929, and in 1979, a Detroit trucking magnate named Manuel Matty Maroon began quietly buying shares. He eventually bought out every other investor, including a stake once held by Warren Buffett, and took full private control. Here's the part most people never think about. The bridge itself isn't really what makes the Maroon family rich. What makes them rich is that the bridge carries more than a quarter of all merchandise trade, by value, moving between the United States and Canada, auto parts, produce, manufactured goods, and for decades, trucks simply had nowhere else to go. The next practical crossing for heavy freight was hours away. Forbes has estimated the bridge generates something in the neighborhood of $60 million a year in tolls. And because it's privately held, the family has never had to publish detailed financials to anyone. That's scale changing the economics. A small regional toll bridge with a few thousand crossings a day can barely cover its own maintenance. A bridge carrying hundreds of millions of dollars in freight every single day, with functionally no substitute, turns the exact same business model, a gate, a toll, a car, into one of the most concentrated private income streams in North America. Notice, too, How differently a bridge like this treats its two kinds of customers. A commuter in a passenger car has choices, or at least believes he does, so pricing tends to stay competitive at that end. A freight company moving auto parts to an assembly plant on a tight production schedule has almost no choice at all. And time is worth more to that company than money. That's why commercial toll rates on major freight crossings tend to run far higher than passenger rates. And why the trucking side of the business, not the daily commuter, quietly ends up carrying most of the revenue. But even a near monopoly isn't permanent, and this is where the Detroit story turns into a live demonstration of the central trap happening right now. For years, Michigan and Canada pushed to build a second, publicly owned crossing a short distance downriver, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a roughly $4.7 billion project. The Moran family fought it for over a decade, through lawsuits, lobbying, and political pressure, arguing the family held something close to an exclusive right to collect tolls on this stretch of river. The new bridge opened in 2026. Its toll for a typical 5-axle truck is roughly $40 lower than the Ambassador's. Economists at the University of Michigan-Flint and Michigan State estimated the family could lose something like $30 million a year in toll revenue once trucking companies simply start choosing the cheaper crossing next door. One problem doesn't stay one problem. Lose the freight traffic, and you don't just lose the toll. You lose the fuel sales at the duty-free plaza. You lose the warehousing business built around bridge access. An asset that spent nearly a century as a guaranteed monopoly is now, for the first time in its history, a bridge with a direct, cheaper competitor sitting a few miles away. That's the single structural weakness sitting underneath every toll bridge in the world. Whether it's a 9-mile connector outside Richmond or the busiest freight crossing in North America, the value isn't the concrete. It's the absence of alternatives. And exclusivity is never something you can fully own. It can be legislated away, built around, or simply outcompeted. And there is very little a bridge owner can do about a government deciding to build a second bridge. Looking forward, the pressure on old-fashioned toll bridges is only building. Electronic tolling and license plate billing have already erased the need for a physical booth, cutting labor costs, but also removing the last bit of friction that used to nudge some drivers toward a free, slower alternative. Dynamic pricing, charging more during rush hour and less overnight, is spreading from urban toll lanes to major crossings, letting owners extract more revenue from the same fixed structure without building anything new. And as governments increasingly treat major crossings as public infrastructure rather than private franchises, the political tolerance for a single family or company controlling an entire trade corridor keeps shrinking. Every one of those trends points the same direction, toward thinner margins for anyone who doesn't already have scale, and toward increasing pressure on the very exclusivity that made bridges, like the Ambassador, so valuable in the first place. So does owning a toll bridge actually make financial sense? At small scale, the evidence is fairly brutal. A regional crossing built on optimistic traffic projections, financed with debt that assumes those projections are correct, is one of the more fragile asset classes in infrastructure. Pocahontas Parkway went through 3 owners and multiple write-downs because a consulting firm's forecast turned out to be wrong by more than half, and nothing about the financing could bend to absorb that. At the scale of something like the Ambassador Bridge, sitting on top of a trade corridor worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year, with decades of near-total exclusivity, the economics become extraordinary. Tens of millions in annual profit off a single fixed structure, requiring almost no ongoing reinvestment beyond maintenance. But exclusivity is the entire asset, and exclusivity is borrowed, not owned. It lasts only until a government, a competitor, or simple geography decides otherwise. So if you do decide to own a toll bridge, understand what you're actually buying. You are not buying steel cables and a roadway across a river. You are buying a temporary absence of alternatives, priced as if it will last forever, and rented back to everyone who has no other way to cross.